Section 5 of The Girl from the Marshcroft by Selma Lagerlöf. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Girl from the Marshcroft, Chapter 5, Part 1. It was decided that Gudmund and Hilder's wedding should be celebrated at Älvåkra the day following Palm Sunday. On the Friday before, Gudmund drove to town to make some purchases for the homecoming banquet, which was to be held at Närlunda the day after the wedding. In the village he happened across a number of young men from his parish. They knew it was his last trip to the city before the marriage and made it the occasion for a carouse. All insisted that Gudmund must drink, and they succeeded finally in getting him thoroughly intoxicated. He came home on Saturday morning so late that his father and the men servants had already gone out to their work, and he slept on until late in the afternoon. When he arose and was going to dress himself, he noticed that his coat was torn in several places. "It looks as though I had been in a fight last night," said he, trying to recall what he had been up to. He remembered this much. He had left the public tavern at 11 o'clock in company with his comrades, but where they had gone afterwards he couldn't remember. It was like trying to peer into a great darkness. He did not know if they had only driven around on the streets or if they had been in somebody's home. He didn't remember whether he or someone else had harnessed the horse, or had no recollection whatever of the drive home. When he came into the living room of the cottage, it was scoured and arranged for the occasion. All work was over for the day, and the household were having coffee. No one spoke of Gudmund's trip. It seemed to be a matter agreed upon that he should have the freedom of living as he chose these last weeks. Gudmund sat down at the table and had his coffee like the others. As he sat pouring it from the cup into the saucer and back into the cup again to let it cool, Mother Ingeborg, who had finished with hers, took up the newspaper which had just arrived and began reading. She read aloud column after column, and Gudmund, his father, and the rest sat and listened. Among other things which she read, there was an account of a fight that had taken place the night before on the big square between a gang of drunken farmers and some laborers. As soon as the police turned up, the fighters fled, but one of them lay dead on the square. The man was carried to the police station, and when no outward injury was found on him, they had tried to resuscitate him. But all attempts had been in vain, and at last they discovered that a knife blade was embedded in the skull. It was the blade of an uncommonly large clasp knife that had pierced the brain and was broken off close to the head. The murderer had fled with the knife handle, but as the police knew perfectly well who had been in the fight, they had hopes of soon finding him. While Mother Ingeborg was reading this, Gudmund set down the coffee cup, stuck his hand in his pocket, pulled out a clasp knife and glanced at it carelessly. But almost immediately he started, turned the knife over, and poked it into his pocket as quickly as though it had burned him. He did not touch the coffee after that, but sat a long while perfectly still, with a puzzled expression on his face. His brows were contracted, and it was apparent that he was trying with all his might to think out something. Finally he stood up, stretched himself, yawned, and walked leisurely toward the door. "I'll have to bestir myself. I haven't been out of doors all day," he said, leaving the room. About the same time Erland Erlandsson also rose. He had smoked out his pipe, and now he went into the side room to get some tobacco. As he was standing in there, refilling his pipe, he saw Gudmund walking along. The windows of the side room did not, like those of the main room, face the yard, but looked out upon a little garden plot with a couple of tall apple trees. Beyond the plot lay a bit of swamp land, where in the spring of the year there were big pools of water, but which were almost dried out in the summer. Toward this side it was seldom that anyone went. Erland Erlandsson wondered what Gudmund was doing there, and followed him with his eyes. Then he saw that the son stuck his hand into his pocket, drew out some object, and flung it away in the morass. Thereupon he walked back across the little garden plot, leaped a fence, and went down the road. As soon as his son was out of sight, Erland in his turn betook himself, as he should have done, to the swamp. He waded out into the mire, bent down, and picked up something his foot had touched. It was a large clasp knife with the biggest blade broken off. He turned it over and over and examined it carefully while he still stood in the water. Then he put it into his pocket, but he took it out again and looked at it before returning to the house. Gudmund did not come home until the household had retired. He went immediately to bed without touching his supper, which was spread in the main room. Erland Erlandsson and his wife slept in the side room. At daybreak Erland thought he heard footsteps outside the window. He got up, drew aside the curtain, and saw Gudmund walking down to the swamp. He stripped off stockings and shoes and waded out into the water, tramping back and forth like one who is searching for something. He kept this up for a long while, then he walked back to dry land as if he intended to go away, but soon turned back to resume his search. A whole hour his father stood watching him. Then Gudmund went back to the house again and to bed. On Palm Sunday Gudmund was to drive to church. As he started to hitch up the horse, his father came out. "You have forgotten to polish the harness today," he said as he walked by, for both harness and cart were muddy. "I have had other things to think of," said Gudmund listlessly, and drove off without doing anything in the matter. After the service Gudmund accompanied his betrothed to Älvåkra and remained there all day. A number of young people came to celebrate Hildur's last evening as a maid, and there was dancing till far into the night. Intoxicants were plentiful, but Gudmund did not touch them. The whole evening he had scarcely spoken a word to anyone, but he danced wildly and laughed at times, loudly and stridently, without anyone's knowing what he was so amused over. Gudmund did not come home until about 2 in the morning, and when he had stabled the horse, he went down to the swamp back of the house. He took off his shoes and stockings, rolled up his trousers, and waded into the water and mud. It was a light spring night, and his father was standing in the side room behind the curtain, watching his son. He saw how he walked, bending over the water and searching as on the previous night. He went up on land between times, but after a moment or two he would wade again through the mud. Once he went and fetched a bucket from the barn and began dipping water from the pools as if he intended to drain them, but really found it unprofitable and set the bucket aside. He tried also with a pool net. He plowed through the entire swamp ground with it, but seemed to bring up nothing but mud. He did not go in until the morning was so well on that the people in the house were beginning to bestir themselves. Then he was so tired and spent that he staggered as he walked, and he flung himself upon the bed without undressing. When the clock struck 8, his father came and waked him. Gudmund lay upon the bed, his clothing covered with mud and clay, but his father did not ask what he had been doing. He simply said, "It is time now to get up," and closed the door. After a while Gudmund came downstairs, dressed in his wedding clothes. He was pale and his eyes wore a troubled expression, but no one had ever seen him look so handsome. His features were as if illumined by an inner light. One felt that one was looking upon something no longer made up of flesh and blood, only of soul and will. It was solemnly ceremonious down in the main room. His mother was in black, and she had thrown a pretty silk shawl across her shoulders, although she was not to be at the wedding. Fresh birch leaves were arranged in the fireplace. The table was spread, and there was a great quantity of food. When they had breakfasted, Mother Ingeborg read a hymn and something from the Bible. Then she turned to Gudmund, thanked him for having been a good son, wished him happiness in his new life, and gave him her blessing. Mother Ingeborg could arrange her words well, and Gudmund was deeply moved. The tears welled to his eyes time and again, but he managed to choke them back. His father, too, said a few words. "It will be hard for your parents to lose you," he said, and again Gudmund came near breaking down. All the servants came forward and shook hands with him and thanked him for the past. Tears were in his eyes all the while. He pulled himself together and made several attempts to speak, but could scarcely get a word past his lips. His father was to accompany him to the wedding and be one of the party. He went out and harnessed the horse, after which he came back and announced that it was time to start. When Gudmund was seated in the cart, he noticed that it was cleansed and burnished. Everything was as bright and shiny as he himself always wished it to be. At the same time he saw also how neat everything about the place looked. The driveway had been laid with new gravel. Piles of old wood and rubbish, which had lain there all his life, were removed. On each side of the entrance door stood a birch branch as a gate of honor. A large wreath of blueberry hung on the weather vane, and from every aperture peeped light green birch leaves. Again Gudmund was ready to burst into tears. He grasped his father's hand hard when he was about to start. It was as though he wished to prevent his going. "Is there something?" said the father. "Oh, no," said Gudmund. "It is best, I dare say, that we go ahead." Gudmund had to say one more farewell before he was very far from the homestead. It was Helga from Big Marsh who stood waiting at the hedge, where the foliage path leading from her home opened into the highway. The father was driving and stopped when he saw Helga. "I've been waiting for you, as I wanted to wish you happiness today," said Helga. Gudmund leaned far out over the cart and shook hands with Helga. He thought that she had grown thin and that her eyelids were red. Very probably she had lain awake and cried all night and was homesick for Närlunda. But now she tried to appear happy and smiled sweetly at him. Again he felt deeply moved, but could not speak. His father, who was reputed never to speak a word until it was called forth by extreme necessity, joined in. "That good wish, I think Gudmund will be more glad over than any other." "Yes, of that you may be sure," said Gudmund. He shook hands with Helga once more, and then they drove on. Gudmund leaned back in the cart and looked after Helga. When she was hidden from view by a couple of trees, he hastily tore aside the apron of the carriage as if he wished to jump out. "Is there anything more you wish to say to Helga?" asked his father. "No, oh no," answered Gudmund and turned round again. Suddenly Gudmund leaned his head against his father's shoulder and burst out crying. "What ails you?" asked Erland Erlandsson, drawing in the reins so suddenly that the horse stopped. "Oh, they are all so good to me, and I don't deserve it." "But you have never done anything wrong, surely?" "Yes, father, I have." "That we can't believe." "I have killed a human being." The father drew a deep breath. It sounded almost like a sigh of relief, and Gudmund raised his head, astonished, and looked at him. His father set the horse in motion again. Then he said calmly, "I'm glad you have told of this yourself. Did you know it already, father?" "I surmised last Saturday evening that there was something wrong, and then I found your knife down in the morass." "So it was you who found the knife?" "I found it, and I noticed that one of the blades had been broken off." "Yes, father. I am aware that the knife blade is gone, but still I cannot get into my head that I did it. It was probably done in the drunkenness and delirium. I know nothing. I remember nothing. I could see by my clothes that I had been in a fight, and I knew that the knife blade was missing." "I understand that it was your intention to be silent about this," said the father. "I thought that perhaps the rest of the party were as irresponsible as myself, and I couldn't remember anything. There was perhaps no other evidence against me than the knife therefore I threw it away. I comprehend that you must have reasoned in that way. You understand, father, that I do not know who is dead. I had never seen him before. I dare say I have no recollection of having done it. I didn't think I ought to suffer for what I had not done knowingly. But soon I got to thinking that I must have been mad to throw the knife into the marsh. It dries out in summer, and then anyone might find it. I tried last night and the night before to find it. Didn't it occur to you that you should confess? No, yesterday I thought only of how I could keep it a secret, and I tried to dance and be merry so that no one would mark any change in me. Was it your intention to go to the bridal altar today without confessing? You were assuming a grave responsibility. Didn't you understand that if you were discovered, you would drag Hildur and her kin with you into misery? I thought that I was sparing them most by saying nothing. They drove now as fast as possible. The father seemed to be in haste to arrive, and all the time he talked with his son. He had not said so much to him in all his life before. I wonder how you came to think differently, said he. It was because Helga came and wished me luck. Then there was something hard in me that broke. I was touched by something in her. Mother also moved me this morning, and I wanted to speak out and tell her that I was not worthy of your love. But then the hardness was still within me and made resistance. But when Helga appeared, it was all over with me. I felt that she really ought to be angry with me, who was to blame for her having to leave our home. Now I think you are agreed with me that we must let the juryman know this at once, said the father. Yes, answered Gudmund in a low tone. Why, certainly, he added almost immediately after, louder and firmer. I don't want to drag Hildur into my misfortune. This she would never forgive me. The Älvåkra folk are jealous of their honor, like the rest, remarked the father. And you may as well know, Gudmund, that when I left home this morning, I was thinking that I must tell the juryman your position if you did not decide to do so yourself. I never could have stood silently by and let Hildur marry a man who at any moment might be accused of murder. He cracked the whip and drove on faster and faster. This will be the hardest thing for you, said he, but we'll try and have it over with quickly. I believe that to the juryman's mind it will be right for you to give yourself up, and they will be kind to you, no doubt. Gudmund said nothing. His torture increased the nearer they approached Älvåkra. The father continued talking to keep up his courage. I have heard something of this sort before, said he. There was a bridegroom once who happened to shoot a comrade to death during a hunt. He did not do it intentionally, and it was not discovered that he was the one who had fired the fatal shot. But a day or two later he was to be married, and when he came to the home of the bride, he went to her and said, "The marriage cannot take place. I do not care to drag you into the misery which awaits me." But she stood dressed in bridal wreath and crown, and took him by the hand and led him into the drawing room, where the guests were assembled, and all was in readiness for the ceremony. She related in a clear voice what the bridegroom had just said to her. I have told her this, that all may know you have practiced no deceit on me. Then she turned to the bridegroom. Now I want to be married to you at once. You are what you are, even though you have met with misfortune, and whatever awaits you, I want to share it equally with you. Just as the father had finished the narrative, they were on the long avenue leading to Älvåkra. Gudmund turned to him with a melancholy smile. It will not end thus for us, he said. Who knows? Said the father, straightening in the cart. He looked upon his son and was again astonished at his beauty this day. It would not surprise me if something great and unexpected were to come to him, thought he. End of section 5. Read by Lars Rolander.